acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Kulin Nation, that there is a continued struggle for the rights of the Indigenous people. I'd like to acknowledge the leaders, the elders that are emerging, that are past, present and future, and recognise that this is stolen land. It's never been ceded, and that it is and always will be Aboriginal land. So just a few housekeeping things. For everybody, you will be muted. You will not be able to speak. The speakers will have the floor. We offer and would love everybody to use the chat room, which is at the bottom of your screen, an icon that says chat. We would love to hear your comments and any questions that you have. Please put them in the chat room and we will collate them, and we will give the speakers an opportunity to answer those questions for you. And there are also at the bottom a couple of icons that you can use. One's called the reactions, and in there is a hand clap and also a thumbs up to say brilliant point or whatever it might be. So you feel free to use those as well. The format of the afternoon, the speaking format, is the first up we have Caleb Maupin. Caleb is a journalist for RT, which is Russia Today, and he's a author. He has published several books, most notably City Builders and Vandals, and very worthwhile reading. And he's a Marxist and political commentator. So I hope that kind of sums it up for you, Caleb. Sure. Next speaker is Tim Anderson. Tim Anderson is a very well-known academic that used and still does work for Sydney University, or works at Sydney University, maybe not.
The court case going on, Helen.
He is also a political analyst and I would say an expert on the situation in the Middle East. And will inform us of what's happening over there. And again, the title of today's meeting is "What is Imperialism and how does it affect us?" And not so much what we can do about it, but because that may lead on to another discussion, but certainly what is happening in the world today. Followed, our third speaker is Daniel Gaspari, who is the Charge d'Affaires from Venezuela and is based in Canberra. And he is a diplomat and very diplomatic as well. Orietta Caponi, she will be joining us later, and she is a political scientist. She is a former ambassador from Venezuela, and as I say, she'll be joining us a bit later. She's based in Bulgaria, so will be joining us later. Joe Montero is from the Venezuelan Solidarity Campaign and also Community Assembly in Victoria, and they are the hosts of today's meeting. And he's going to try and wrap it all up and sum up the meeting as best he can. So I think I just want to explain how this meeting came about, and I know probably quite a few people already understand how this meeting began. But it occurred out of a meeting that happened in Venezuela in January 2020, and it's also come from Cuba as well. So it's a call for people around the world to build a movement against imperialism, a united movement against imperialism. And I think the key thing about that meeting that struck me, and I attended that meeting along with Lucho, Joe, and three other people from Australia. There was Vinny from Western Australia, Saul from Queensland, and Paul from Sydney. All unionists and communists. We attended that meeting, and I think the key thing that came out of that meeting for me was when George Azaria said that we do not have 30 years to wait, and I think that was the key thing. We don't have another 30 years for another Chavez to be to be found amongst us. We don't have another 200 years for a Simon Bolivar either to arise out of us. So there's an impending sense of the necessity to develop a movement that really is not tied to the left, but we want to take it from the movement out to the masses. So I think for me that was the key thing about that meeting. So without anything further from me, I would like to hand it over to Caleb Maupin.
Sure. Well, I thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure, and I do want to give my best greetings to everyone in Australia and everyone who's dedicated to fighting against imperialism and fighting against the bosses and bankers that run the world. I'm speaking to you now from Brooklyn, the borough of New York City, and just over about 2 hours ago, here in Brooklyn, it was reported that there are police cars on fire. And that there are police precincts that are being stormed by protesters. Now, my wife and I were staying indoors. We're nice and safe here in our apartment, but there's a lot of chaos out on the streets tonight of New York City, from what we understand. And so that kind of sets the tone for what I've been asked to speak about, which is what is imperialism. And it's very, very important in this time to be clear that imperialism is a system, and that system is in a deep state of crisis. And we're watching that crisis unfold. And that's essentially what we're watching as we watch so many global events take place. Now, there's a lot of confusion about what imperialism is. Among academia, you'll get often references to cultural imperialism. People think that imperialism is the fact that movies from the United States and Western Europe are seen all over the world, that people in the Middle East eat hamburgers and hot dogs or something like that. A lot of people will tell you that imperialism is a verb, right? It's if a country attacks another country, it's engaging in imperialism. Well, those are not correct understandings, right? Imperialism is a system. It is a system in which bankers and billionaires in the Western countries dominate the world economy. If you want to understand the nature of imperialism, you have to understand that imperialism is about holding back economic development. Imperialism is not about civilizing people around the world. It's not about raising their living standards. It's not about giving them the opportunity to participate in the free market. Imperialism is about holding back economic development. A great example would be when the British Empire went to India. India was a civilization that had been weaving for thousands of years. They had been weaving cloth, but when the British Empire went to India, did they immediately put the people of India to work weaving all kinds of cloth to take back to the homeland? Well, no, they didn't. They burned down the textile mills, and they forced them to import their cloth from Britain. Another example of imperialism more recently would be the NAFTA situation. That Mexico, a country where people have been farming and growing their own food for thousands and thousands of years, was basically forced into a situation where the country is a captive market of the United States and has to import its food from American agribusiness corporations, right? Another example, you can look at Iraq and Libya. Both of those countries were prosperous oil-producing, oil-exporting countries. They had used the oil proceeds to develop their own domestic economies. Now, as a result of U.S. Military interventionism, both of the countries have been reduced to rubble and chaos. And many people at the time who were correctly opposing those military interventions, they said, well, the United States is acting kind of like Viking raiders, right? They're going to Libya, they're going to Iraq, and they're trying to get their oil. They're trying to take their oil. But if you look at Iraq and Libya right now, their rate of oil production is far, far lower than it was under the leadership of the Islamic Socialist government in Libya or the Ba'ath Socialist government in Iraq. Essentially, these countries have been demolished, blown to bits. Ethnic conflicts and rivalries have been expanded, and these countries that were once prosperous and producing their own oil and selling their oil on the international markets have been reduced to chaos. And now everyone who is buying their oil from Iraq or Libya is mostly buying it from Saudi Arabia, a country where the oil is under the control of the big four super majors based in the United States, in Britain, BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Royal Dutch Shell. This is essentially what it's about. I summarize imperialism by saying imperialism is about keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. That is the essence of what imperialism is. And I talk about my own experiences. You know, I recall when I was 12 years old, because of unique circumstances in my life, I got to visit Quito, Ecuador. I was 12 years old, and it was the year of 1999. And I, of course, had no understanding of economics or Marxism or anything like that at that time. But I visited Quito, Ecuador in 1999. And I got off the plane in Quito, and I just saw crowds and crowds of desperate, starving people on every corner of the capital city. I mean, just mass poverty. And I didn't know who these people were or why they were so desperate. But what had happened was that Ecuador had been forced to give up its own currency. It had been forced to adopt the US dollar. And as in exchange for getting loans from the IMF and the World Bank, it had been forced to adopt austerity measures. It had had its domestic economy crushed. And as a result of that, many indigenous people in the countryside were being thrown off their lands, and there was just mass poverty and suffering. And 1999, that same year, was a year that after, you know, about a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union, or, you know, 6 or 7 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, you had so much poverty and suffering in Russia, right? You know, in Russia at that point, there was a huge rise in sex trafficking, a huge rise in unemployment. The heroin addiction rate and opioids was through the roof. And Russia was also in a situation where it couldn't produce its own food and was being forced to import all of its food from the United States. And Russia's manufacturing, you know, American firms would buy the Russian steel mills and then shut them down after purchasing them. Everything, the economy of Russia had shut down. But there were two very big elections in that year of 1999. In 1998, the previous year, there had been an election, and Hugo Chavez had been elected, and he took office in 1999 to lead Venezuela. 1999, we also saw the election of Vladimir Putin in Russia. And those were pivotal moments because this was essentially a response to the fact that neoliberalism and the imposition of free market extremism on so much of the world, most especially Eastern Europe and South and Central America, that it was producing so much of an economic crisis that people were resisting, and that there was a need for new forces to come into power. Popular movements, resistance, hostility to the imposition of austerity had resulted in some electoral victories. And the election of Hugo Chavez, the election of Vladimir Putin kind of represented a rolling back of those trends. Though at the time, people didn't realize it, right? I mean, the election of Hugo Chavez in 1999, it didn't really get a lot of attention in American media. The same with the election of Vladimir Putin. People didn't realize what was happening in 1999, but many, many big things were to come. You know, it's important to note that imperialism is not about fighting terrorism. It's not about fighting for democracy. It's not about spreading human rights. It's about fighting against economic development. It's about keeping countries in a state of poverty and in a state of suffering. The primary targets of the imperialists in the Middle East, for example, they're not targeting Al-Qaeda. They're not targeting ISIS. They're targeting governments like the Syrian Arab Republic, governments where, you know, Christians and Sunnis and Shias live in peace with each other. They're targeting countries like Iran, where the country has developed an independent economy and has stabilized and developed. And what do they seek to replace these stable, independent economies with? Chaos and destruction, again, so that they can maintain their monopoly. You know, I use the example of if you had a store and you were selling flowers, and someone across the street had a store and they were selling flowers, would you want to go take over their store and have two stores selling flowers? No, you would want them to be eliminated. So everyone had to purchase flowers from you. That's what imperialism is. It's about clearing the market with chaos and destruction so that Wall Street and London can maintain their monopoly. And you know, in the Cold War, you did see the rise of these kind of military juntas and authoritarian regimes that were backed by the United States in places like South Korea, you know, in South and Central America, the Philippines, elsewhere. And the reason those regimes were propped up was because they needed them as a barrier against the threat of communist revolution. But what we saw starting with Pinochet in 1973 was a new kind of formulation. Unlike the Kennedy administration that was trying to allow some level of development to stabilize and hold off the threat of revolution, we saw the imposition of dramatic free market reforms and gutting and looting of countries. And that was a big shift. And it most extremely escalated after the fall of the Soviet Union. We saw in Bolivia where water resources, for example, were privatized and sold off to American corporations. We saw, across Eastern Europe, how just country after country was just reduced economically to rubble and just, demolished economically. This is the nature of what imperialism really is. And I think that, when you want to understand what's happening now, in the very moment we're in, when I talk about what's happening outside on the streets of New York City as we speak, what's important is to look at, there's a pamphlet by Vladimir Lenin that he published. Everyone knows Lenin wrote a book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. But before that, the first document where Lenin laid out his understanding of what imperialism was called Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. And if you read it, that's where he gives a definition economically of what imperialism is. And furthermore, he lays out that one of the essential things of moving the United States and Britain and France and Germany and other Western capitalist powers to imperialism was the development of what was called the aristocracy of labor. And this was a layer of well-paid workers within these countries who, yes, they were workers, yes, they were exploited by their bosses, but because they had a significantly higher living standard and were seeing their wages and living standards increase, they had become loyal to empire and they'd been essentially bought off. And it was that layer of well-paid, kind of almost middle-class workers that stabilized the imperialist homelands enough that they could go around the world and engage in expanding and beating down countries around the world to maintain their monopoly. They had to have that stability at home. And what we're seeing now in the current era is the systemic demolition within the imperialist centers of that aristocracy of labor. Living standards are dramatically decreasing. Across the United States, we're seeing, roads that are unpaved. We're seeing, water not being properly purified. We're seeing a younger generation that is stuck in just a lifetime of low-wage, short-term service sector jobs, and that it's largely because of technology, with artificial intelligence, with the lack of a need for manufacturing workers. We're seeing the demolition of this aristocracy of labor that was the basis of stability within the imperialist centers that allowed them to expand around the world. And that lays the basis for a higher level of solidarity than ever before. Polls show in the United States that never before in my lifetime, I mean, going back to the 60s and 70s, never before has there been so much opposition to U.S. military interventions around the world. The public doesn't want it. They see their country crumbling all around them. And especially now amid this pandemic, they see it. And I just wanted to end by touching on, the very important development of the fact that the United States, U.S. leaders, Trump and Pompeo, they just fumed with anger about the fact that there was shipments and vessels from Iran going to Venezuela. And they announced that they were going to somehow stop this from happening. They wouldn't tolerate it. How dare Iran and Venezuela trade with each other? But they weren't able to stop it, right? We've seen that those vessels from Iran have arrived in Venezuela, and Venezuela and Iran are trading with each other. And if you look at that, this in essence is what the imperialist system is afraid of. The United States has cut off Iran with sanctions, tried to isolate it from the world economy. The United States has tried to cut off Venezuela and isolate it from the world economy. And so the two countries are trading with each other. They don't need the imperialist bankers to be the middleman, right? They're trading with each other. And this is what the imperialists are afraid of. They're also afraid of the One Belt, One Road initiative led by China and what China is doing. They're afraid of the BRICS countries. They're afraid of Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. The fact that there is an alternative on the global economy where countries that have been kept chronically poor by imperialism are able to start trading with each other. They're no longer dependent. They're able to help each other develop win-win cooperation. This points the way out of this disaster as we see an increasing crisis, not just within the United States, but within the imperialist centers with, increasing rivalries and divisions among the capitalists as they fight among each other, as the living standard is dropping. There's a rising police state here in the United States. As we see all of this developing, we see countries that were kept chronically poor by the Western imperialists start to rise up from poverty and start to trade with each other and start to build an alternative network. And the thing is, within the Western countries, there are many people that realize that Wall Street and London is not their friend, and that Wall Street and London enrich themselves at the expense not just of people all over the world, but of people right here in the imperialist centers. And increasingly, I believe there is an opportunity for there to be people within the Western countries who realize that hostility to Venezuela, hostility toward Iran, hostility towards Syria, hostility to China and Russia is not in their benefit. And that if we could begin to trade with Russia and trade with China and trade with Venezuela and trade with Iran in a way that was based on win-win cooperation, in a way that was not predatory, this would lay the basis for lots of new jobs, lots of new opportunities. But really, that would require a change in how the U.S. economy is set up. We have an economy based on predatory oil monopolies, on military weapons manufacturing, and basically the global racket of selling weapons all over the world, and turning war into a way to make profits. I mean, the U.S. economy is an imperialist economy. That's not benefiting the people of the United States. It's certainly not benefiting the people of the world. But people are waking up to that more and more. And I think that creates an opportunity for us, and it presents the opportunity for those of us who are opposed to imperialism, opposed to keeping the world poor so Wall Street and London to stay rich. It creates an opportunity for us to point the way forward, point the way toward peace, social stability, ending oppression, and fighting for justice. So that's my conclusion.
Thank you, Caleb. Thank you very much for that. That was brilliant. So I'd like to just go straight into giving Tim the floor and ask him for his contributions on this subject. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you to the organisers. Thank you, Helen, Anissa, those who've organised this forum, and everyone who's participating. I want to build a little bit on what Caleb's very apt words, just a little bit on the broad sort of theoretical side before going into some more practical considerations. And I want to add a humanist element to the analysis there. If imperialism, to me, is a project of domination led by a dictatorial state, a single state, which has necessarily powers of life and death in an imperial army, an army that does nothing, or an armed force that does nothing but extend its power into other people's regions and nations. And if we go back to Lenin, who was really the first of in the Marxist tradition to talk about imperialism, there's some very good lessons from Lenin, but I think the world has changed quite a bit. For example, now Lenin identified two things really in his theory of imperialism. One was that the First World War, which the context he was talking about, there was a competition between empires, because you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire and so on. The situation is rather different today. The other thing he identified was that financial monopolies were the cutting edge of this type of imperialism, and I think that's still very true today. But we can't really translate the First World War context to today, because if we do, we'll have some, I believe, misguided people saying that, well, this is just a competition between the Chinese Empire and the US Empire, or the Russian Empire and the US Empire. Now, I think the character of Russia and China today is better seen as counterweights to a unipolar imperialism from the US rather than a competition between empires. I think there's a misunderstanding on parts of the left, because they left Lenin out of that context of 100 years ago and don't recognize the difference between, let's say, a China, including in the economic sense of neo-Marxism, where the exporter of capital was imperialism. Well, the US has been importing capital for decades, but it still has 800 military bases around the world and is intervening in most parts of the world. Russia, I think, has about 3 external military bases. So Russia and China, to me, are very important counterweights. They might become empires sometime in the future, but they're a very long way from it. So I don't think we should be misled. We should go down the track of saying this is a competition between empires, which was Lenin's way of being an anti-war activist, basically, at that time, back during the First World War. Another thing from the humanist point of view is that imperialism today has been identified in the post-colonial era, which is, we're really talking about the second half of the 20th century onwards, because although Latin America got its independence in the 19th century, a lot of the, and there's a lot been written in Latin literature about this and about the need for a second independence from the neo-colonial regimes that were created there. In the post-colonial era, we had a very strong international consensus on something called the self-determination of peoples. And that was in a declaration on decolonization in December 1960, which was lifted, the text of that was lifted straight out into the first principle of the International Bill of Rights in the mid-60s. So if you look at the international covenants on civil and political rights and economic, social and cultural rights, you will see the first principle there, always ignored by the Western powers, is the right of peoples to self-determination. And this was a reaction to imperialism and to colonialism. It's a very powerful consensus that's there as a tool for humanists to talk about, you know, the opposition to intervention and so on, the opposition to what empires do, basically. And interesting, you know, for students of history, if you go back to the countries that opposed that, there was no opposition to that declaration on decolonization in 1960, but there were about 10 nations that abstained: the US, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, a number of countries, South Africa, a number of countries that had colonies or had significant indigenous self-determination struggles going on there. So in other words, historically, the founding principle of the International Bill of Rights today was something that was created by the Soviet Union and developing countries, former colonies, and it wasn't opposed because they felt they couldn't oppose it in 1960, but nevertheless, they never took it to heart, the big powers, the Western powers, the former colonial powers. And so today we see, you know, for example, there's a type of a shuffle going on between the former colonial powers, and I'm including the US in that, although the US has somewhat of a separate status because we know the US developed a unique language of liberty at the same time as they managed the largest slave economy in human history. They developed, it's quite a skill really, I think it's too trite to call it hypocrisy because it's quite a skill to talk about universal liberties and inspire people with that when you had the biggest slave system in human history. But nevertheless, they, for example, with France and Britain today, make the decisions about who's going to go into Libya, who's going to manage the Syrian situation, who's going to manage Palestine, because that was formerly, you know, a British colony, and Lebanon and Syria were former French colonies and so on. So there's a great deal of delegation going on. And of course, that explains why the Security Council is paralyzed these days too, because we've got those three big colonial powers that won't allow any significant expression of a genuine international community in international affairs. So updating to the present, I think that, you know, the tactic of empires has always been to divide and rule. You know, the British learned it from the Romans. The Nazis tried to borrow it from the British too. They were great admirers of the British Empire, particularly the ruthlessness of the British Empire was something that inspired the Nazis. Divide and rule is an important tactic, and it's been going on in Latin America for a long time. It's been going on in the Middle East for a long time. And to a large extent, it's been successful. I think we have to recognize the great skill in the propaganda wars that imperialism carries out today. They will single out little countries or groups. They will exceptionalize them, you know, as they exceptionalize themselves. Everyone else has to have a weak state, except the hegemon, you know, the global superpower that has to have a strong state to be the world policeman and so on. But they will single out a little people, whether it's Cuba or Syria or whatever, and try and break them down even further, you know, to break Iraq or Syria down into little warring ethnic statelets, for example, and try and keep those countries apart. And that's why the great projects in Latin America, led by Bolivar, by Fidel Castro, by Hugo Chavez, were precisely to bring those countries together because, as Jose Marti said in the late 19th century, the trees have to form ranks so the giant with the 7-league boots doesn't pass between them. And that he recognized back then, even before Cuba was independent, that these little former colonies of Spain could not stand up to Spain alone and the future threat of the US. They had to join together. And that was the life work of the late, great Hugo Chavez to create those big regional organizations for that purpose. And, you know, there's been a checkered path, but nevertheless, it still exists in Latin America, UNASUR, CELAC, the ALBA, all of those regional groups. And you see something a little bit similar going on in the Middle East. Although I have to say, being part of some Latin American network groups and some Middle Eastern network groups, there is so much going on in the Middle East. There is so much going on in Latin America that it's a whole world, and people absorb themselves in those worlds. But we see today, as Caleb pointed out, that precisely the collaboration between Iran and Venezuela, for example, is one of the most inspiring, astounding measures of resistance in the world today, because it crosses oceans, literally crosses continents and oceans, and says, here are these very different states that are going to collaborate together to resist imperialism in the form of these, what we probably shouldn't call sanctions. We should refer to them as coercive unilateral measures or siege warfare, because sanctions sounds like it's some legitimate thing imposed on some sort of wrongdoing. No, it's unilateral coercive measures which are illegal in the international system. And I wrote a chapter about the illegality of sanctions in my book, Axis of Resistance. But practically speaking, you know, every new intervention these days, whether it's Libya or Iraq or Syria or Venezuela or whatever it is, has used exceptionalist particular pretexts. You know, they've always been false pretexts for war, of course, but those pretexts are exceptional to try and say this, you know, Bashar al-Assad in Syria was the new Hitler, who was somehow for years and years was killing his own people and murdering children and destroying hospitals, and for some reason the people still supported him, you know. And so long as it was that myth, which was a very powerful myth because it was repeated every day by the corporate media, it became difficult. I know I had this experience of it, of trying to say, well, hang on a minute, look at the evidence here. But once we start to bring together the different projects, the different war projects, we start to see the links, you know. People, the extraordinary thing is, and it's a great concern to me, what is wrong with the Western mind, with the Western mentality, including the Western left, because they have been fooled so many times. But they, over Iraq, for example, the weapons of mass destruction scam, we know that was a scam. They admitted it was a scam. And then a few years later on, the chemical weapon stuff in Syria, they do the same thing all over again. And they're still doing it to this day, basically. With Libya, they had the same sort of thing, but then when Libya was destroyed, they didn't care anymore, really. People will regret and say all sorts of things about Libya because it doesn't matter anymore, because it was going to be a decade or two before that country is rebuilt to have some sort of political will. So anyway, the point I'm getting to here is that once we start to link up these struggles, these resistance struggles, once you have Iraq and Iran and Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Yemen together, then you have something that imperialism really fears in the Middle East. And once you link up Venezuela and Cuba and Bolivia, and well, it depends what's coming and going in the mix there. You know, unfortunately, we have a disaster in Ecuador, we have a disaster in Brazil, but nevertheless, the strength of those alliances has been very important. And so I think from the point of view of Western activists, which is, I think, a lot of us here, making those sorts of links is very important. Within the Latin American context, within the Middle East context, but also crossing those sorts of boundaries. And there's a bit of that going on now. You know, there are, for example, a number of important networks, cultural, educational, activist networks in Latin America. There's a number of those also in the Middle East, but they tend to be absorbed in their own particular struggles. You know, the links between those two I find very exciting, very inspiring, because just like the Iran-Venezuela collaboration with those, you know, symbolic 5 boats, basically, which the empire threatened to block and couldn't do it because they feared the consequence. Because as a Cuban journalist recently wrote, look, the empire only attacks weak states that are defenseless. You know, they hesitated to attack Syria because they knew that Russia was a long-time ally with Syria. They attacked Libya because Libya was isolated and had disarmed itself. Well, making those sorts of links, I think, is the natural counter-hegemonic response to the imperial strategy of divide and rule. The more we can make those links between resistance struggles and the common threads there, the more that we can draw attention to these important achievements, not just the achievement of the 5 boats between Iran and Venezuela, but the history that went before that. Because now the Iranians are quoting back to the Venezuelans, with love, love is repaid. And they're quoting Chavez back to them. In Syria, they know about Chavez too. Chavez was in Syria, and there's some extraordinary stories there. So some of those crossover links I find extraordinarily powerful. And so really, I think, in face of imperial globalism, we have to develop a type of resistance globalism where we can make good use of those links. So I think I'll finish there. Thanks for your time.
So thank you very much, Tim, for that wonderful contribution to the discussion. I would like now to ask Daniel Gaspari, Charge d'Affaires from Venezuela, based in Canberra, to say a few words.
Thank you. Do you hear me all? Yes. Okay. I have some doubts regarding if you were going to hear me or not. Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very much to all of you for being here today. And it's like very, you know, I mean, vitalizer to hear you talking about, you know, my country and many other good countries in the world. And I would like to present today kind of a very short report about what's happening in Venezuela, and certainly very focused on the latest activities that US did against my country. So thank you, LastNet and colleagues, comrades, for organizing this event today. So I will start saying you that that's, as you might know, there's no doubt that currently my country faces an economic situation, mainly because of the economic and financial blockade from US. This blockade started during Obama's administration after 2014. And at that time, Obama signed an executive order declaring Venezuela as an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security. This was completely ridiculous because certainly, as you know, Venezuela don't represent any threat to US and not even to any other country in the world. But imagine US, which is a very big and powerful country, you know, in terms of army and weapons. So how can we be, you know, a threat to the security of, you know, US? And certainly, in fact, Venezuela is a peace country, and we haven't declared war to any nation in the world since 150 years. So there's no doubt that Venezuela is a peaceful country, unlike USA, you know, USA, whose policy of interventionism is part of their agenda every day. As I was mentioning, after 2014, a series of unilateral coercive measures were taken by USA, and this in order to suffocate our economy. This is not the first time the US using violent means attempt to overthrow a government that doesn't follow their interests. And that's imperialist, of course, as Tim mentioned before. That's the way as the imperialist countries act. And this, as we have many examples in Latin America, there are no doubts what happened, especially in the last 70 years with Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and other countries which you very well represent in Australia. So because of these illegal actions, you know, Venezuela has been unable to use the international banking system, making it virtually impossible to engage in foreign trade or refinance the debt. This has caused, as you know, in the last days, shortages of fuel, shortages of food, and also medicines. We have been unable to buy necessary parts to service our oil industry or purchase additives to refine our own petroleum. You know, despite, as you know, Venezuela is has the biggest reserve of oil in the world. Fortunately, and thanks to the legacy of Commander Chavez, we have many friends around the world. As you know, for late Chavez, international cooperation was key to build an equal world. And despite the blockade and the sabotage of our legitimate institutions, we have managed to keep running our social programs. It's not a secret for all of you that Misión Vivienda, which is the major housing social program of my country, has been moving forward, close to deliver the 3,100,000 house. This just was only a week ago. So also the CLAP, which is the food program for special to deliver food for the most vulnerable sectors, And I was happy to show some figures, but if I show the figures, this will take a long time. So, but as you can see, the CLAP, the food program get up to 6 million Venezuelan families around the country. Even with the cooperation and help that we receive, it's hard when our funds, are frozen and we have to buy medicines and food. We had to find new ways to continue keeping all the social programs running. We are resisting building a model in benefit of all Venezuelans, which is very well known by people, Us, US is not only blocking our assets, but threatening all the companies that try to do business with us. Just yesterday, they were trying to block some ships that were bringing, among the ships from Iran, 2 more ships that were bringing gasoline from Africa. And so they still, through a triangle done by Iran through Liberia. So, but I must admit also that in 2019 was a particularly difficult year. Also, it's very well known that a group of 40 countries recognized Juan Guaido, who self-proclaimed president of Venezuela. Despite that, we got presidential elections, and took in place in May 2018, where President Maduro was elected with a big majority of the votes. And I need to say this because even though Australia recognized Juan Guaido, the most, inside decision from Australia was that there were observers from this country in Venezuela for these elections, who did a wonderful report letting people know that these elections were clear and transparent, as we all know. Unfortunately, this self-proclamation of Juan Guaido, who was not elected to be a president, by the way, gave more power to the US, who managed to freeze all our assets around the world, but especially, which of course hits very strong our economy, was the freeze of Citgo, which is a big major oil company, state-owned company, owned by my country, by my people, and it's located around US. Nowadays, Venezuela has one of the more of the $30 billion. I want to be exactly in the amounts, which is $30 billion frozen in international banks. Many people ask me how this could happen. Well, it's easy because when we try to do transfers around the world, those transfers don't get through, and they freeze the money, and the banks keep the money. So actually, at this moment, there are a lot of banks who have been holding Venezuela's money for an around amount of $30 billion. And this is in Portugal, in Great Britain, and of course in US, and a lot of other countries. There were also, as you heard in the media, we are suing the Bank of England because they are also retaining 30 tons of gold, which belongs to Venezuelan citizens. There's no reason for the Bank of England to, restrain the access to the gold, but certainly they do it. And we are now bringing this to a higher level in order to bring it to the international court by our Minister of Foreign Affairs. So hopefully we got a good decision from them, a fair decision, and we can handle this gold, which is part of our reserves, and it should be destinated for the people of my country, for the food, for medicine, especially on these difficult times of coronavirus, which I'm going to talk in a while. Well, there's no doubt that the biggest robbery in the history of Venezuela was done during the Trump government. It is amazing. It's not only Citgo, it's not only the gold, it's not only the freezing amounts of money in the banks, also Monómeros, which is a company in Colombia. Colombia, you should know that they work close, they are allies from US. Well, they work together. So this company also is close to getting bankrupt. Bankruptcy has also happened with Citgo in the US. So we think that if we cannot handle again the company, Venezuelans will lose Citgo, which finally was, you know, the real reason of why Mr. Trump was willing to empower Juan Guaido in order to take control of this company in the US by US. So again, after these 40 countries, 40 to 50 countries gave false recognition to Guaido in 2019, his representative started to receive funds to manage the situation in Venezuela from these companies and try to overthrow President Maduro. Later, it was evident that this team collected a large amount of money with no explanations, with the excuse of humanitarian aid, and they even organized a concert in the border with Venezuela in a small Colombian city called Cucuta. Some journalists' investigation after all this year had proved that the money was stolen by Guaido and his team, and they never intended to help any Venezuelan people. There was not humanitarian aid on this truck, because it was a couple of trucks, but really only one truck with some boxes on it. But finally, the same opposition burned the trucks, and that realizes what was inside of the boxes, and there was nothing. So it was only a theater done by the opposition in order to try to overthrow President Maduro. They never intend to help Venezuelan people, but yes, they were willing to take personal advantage of the situation. With this economic situation, I need to add, more than 2 million of Venezuelan people have left the country. It's a number which we can still don't have clearly how much it is, but these are official numbers. Some other countries, of course, with a political bias, they try to give numbers around 4 million, 6 million, but certainly official numbers say that there are not more than 2 million people in the last 4 years, and certainly for economic reasons, not political reasons, as many media and people and opposition members want to show to the world. Figures about the number of Venezuela that have left the country are not very clear, you know, because also since this is tied to humanitarian aid, so many countries, especially in the region and last week in Europe, are trying to take advantage, economically talking, take advantage of this situation. I don't want to finish this without talking about COVID-19, which is, I think, a very important theme on these days, a challenge on these days on the world. And Venezuela has reported the lowest number of cases in the whole America, the whole continent. I mean, from North to South America. And we have also the shortest numbers in people who pass away, which only 10 people pass away. In a country of 30 million people is certainly an amazing number. Our government is making a huge effort to contain the COVID-19. It's difficult, especially in our cultures, because usually we don't like to stay at home. You know how Latin thinks, they want to go out, Latin people want to go outside. It's difficult for the government to contain them, you know, and a democratic way to contain them in homes, but certainly a very good program of health is working in place, even though the situation that I mentioned before, economic situation that I mentioned before, that we are facing, you know. And then giving numbers of this, yesterday we report 1,370 number of cases of COVID. In the last 2 weeks have been double number, because we are repatriating our compatriots from countries from Colombia and Brazil and Ecuador and Chile, you know, where the numbers are very, very high. So it's very difficult for us to contain the virus when we are bringing people back home, you know, especially from these countries where numbers are completely, you know, crazy. So we have 302 recovers, and as I mentioned before, only 10, unfortunately, 10 people who passed away because of COVID. And since this pandemic began a few months ago, all embassies and consulates all around the world have been reporting thousands of requests of Venezuelan citizens who wants to return back to the country. And it's not, it's also an example what's happening in Australia. We have more than 1,000 Venezuelans waiting to go back to my country. Almost impossible because, you know, the lack of flights doesn't allow us to bring people as we want back home, but we try to do our best, especially for those countries who are our neighbors and where the situation is worse, where they need to really come back home. And then, you know, Colombia and Chile and Ecuador are, and Brazil. Brazil, I think, is getting now to the second place of the world in number of cases of coronavirus. So our borders are also very difficult to control. And the south with Colombia and Brazil, there's mostly a big jungle, so it's very difficult to control. And many of these compatriots came through the jungle in order to get back to reach their families, and most of them, they bring the COVID to Venezuela. But certainly with this, we still have the best numbers of the whole continent. And we have been receiving, as I mentioned before, a lot of compatriots back. I need to mention also the program that we have implemented 1 year ago, which is called Vuelta a la Patria, which is return to the country. And this is done for nationals who are living overseas and wish to safely return to Venezuela. The most, you know, sad thing of the return to the country is that many of them have been facing racism and xenophobia, and as well as a lot of forms of slavery in the other countries of Latin America. This program, I need to mention also that this program is completely free. They don't pay a coin to be repatriated to Venezuela, and it's done mostly by the local airline, the national airline, which is Conviasa, that is flying to all these places, trying to bring people back home with no cost at all. And there's, well, this of course is not convenient for media to show how Venezuela are returning to their countries, the Venezuelan people. No media is showing this, only of course the media, the local media from Venezuela, which certainly is more objective talking is more objective, because of course nobody wants to show this. They only want to show people going out from Venezuela, but they don't want to show, you know, all these people coming back to us. And certainly, despite this, we need to recognize also that we have almost 6 million Colombians who have moved to Venezuela because of the situation that Colombia has in this internal wall since more than 40 years. And not a secret for anybody what's happening in Colombia. And we receive almost 6 million people, which is almost 20% of the population of Venezuela, who are Colombians. And they are part of our social programs, are part of our housing programs, and also we deliver health programs for them, same as if they are Venezuelans. By the way, many of these people are also Venezuelan and Colombian at this stage because they have double nationality. My country accepts the double nationality. So many of them have the two nationalities. And just to finish, I want to mention the recently, you know, attack that happens on the 3 of May, Operación Gedeón. This was very well organized and is completely demonstrated now by the US government with, of course, the complicity of the government of Colombia. And this were a very big group of armed men who tried to land on the shores of Venezuela. And the only objective, or the main objective, of course, was to kidnap President Maduro, and as well as hike, you know, official leaders, which are, of course, part of the government. And it was partially led by American mercenaries. There were testimonies of a lot of these mercenaries who said that these were American mercenaries. The President Maduro did an amazing speech showing the passport of 2 of them. And they said that they work for this mercenary company, which is Silver. And this company from US was also the one who was in charge of the security of the concert that I mentioned before in the Colombian city of Cucuta. And so there are many proof that Trump was, you know, involved in this. The guy who's the CEO from this company American company was on the first, ring of security. Many pictures show him on the ring of security of President Trump. So there's no doubt that President Trump was involved with it. Even though after this, he didn't recognize, they said that they didn't were part of this. They were, of course, part of this, intent of attack and overthrow the legitimate government of Venezuela. So I think that with this, I finish. I just want, before I finish, to let you know that sanctions are worse than coronavirus. Sanctions are hitting our population very strongly, and certainly we need to do all the best in order to try to push the government of US in order to withdraw the sanctions against Venezuela. Thanks all of you for this time. I hope you understand my poor English, and certainly you can, I am happy to answer any question after the rest of the people, the colleagues were talking. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It was fantastic, and it's always good to know what's going on in Venezuela. Always good to keep our eye on what's happening, and I think it shows the different way that a socialist country considers the value of human life in comparison to the value that capitalists and countries that are tied to imperialism, how they value human life. And without saying anything further, I'd like to ask Orietta if she would like to contribute to the discussion. Thank you very much.
So, can't hear
you. We can't hear you, Orietta. It might be a connection. If you can press down in the left-hand side, there's a little microphone and there's a little upward arrow, and you might need to select a microphone. That's one of the common confusing bits about Zoom. I think we still can't hear you. If you can't find a way to connect in the bottom left hand, sometimes it can, when you arrive, it asks you to connect to the audio of your computer. So you can either try turning up your volume, or you could even try leaving the meeting and coming back in. Sometimes that helps. Oh no, that was someone else. Yeah, sorry, we can't hear you. Is there a volume you could check?
Oh, audio. She's left the meeting for now.
Okay, so hopefully she can join. Yeah, it's a lot harder than being in person.
So maybe just while Orietta is coming back into the meeting, we have a question from May, and maybe we could just think about that question and have a discussion. If people put their, looks like Orietta's back in. But May has asked the question, first by helping expose some of the truths about imperialist intervention. No, sorry. Basically, how do we fight imperialism? So that might be something that people want to discuss as well.
Orietta, are you trying to speak? We still can't hear you. One other trick I've seen be used is if somebody wants to call Orietta on a phone and then hold it up to their speaker. It's a bit old-fashioned, but it works.
Okay, I'm calling Orietta. Just a second, please.
Thank you.
So is, would anybody like to, Tim, Caleb, sorry, perhaps I can put that question to you. How do we fight imperialism?
Well, my feeling, if you look at the Bolivarian movement in particular, was there was a dramatic shift in tactics. You know, in the 1970s and 80s, when there was all these military juntas, and you know, at that point, revolutionaries in Latin America primarily used guerrilla warfare. But in the 90s, when things changed, the conditions changed, it was once again possible to organize in the cities. It was once again possible to participate in free elections. Then you had the rise of neoliberalism, which was decimating economies. The revolutionaries and socialists of Latin America drastically changed their tactics in order to win. And I think that in the West, those of us who are anti-imperialist and socialist need to drastically change our tactics. You know, much of the left in the United States is coming out of the 1960s new left. It's the folks who protested the Vietnam War, and that's an amazing tradition, you know, amazing heroism of, you know, refusing to fight in the wars and you know, getting arrested, and there was a lot. But that movement was very much on the college campuses, and it was very much a middle class current. It was among the African American community, and it was, you know, it was middle class. But now in the United States, we are seeing a huge drop in living standards, but it seems to be only the right that is able to kind of capture the economic anger rising among the population. It's right-wing populism that kind of captured the anger, and the left still seems to cling to these anti-populist narratives. This idea that average Americans, that populism and fighting for the people and economic demands, that this is somehow racist or chauvinist, and that being a leftist is about, you know, expressing feelings of alienation. You know, there's the work of the Frankfurt School and Adorno and all the new left politics are there, and that kind of creates a barrier between anti-imperialists and Marxists and the masses of people. And I think that we need to figure out how we can get to the masses. I'm very inspired by what's going on in Britain with the Workers' Party right now, and George Galloway, and how they are kind of breaking out of the traditional left spaces and trying to get to the masses. And there are some other examples of that in Europe. But we need to figure out how we can tap into the population at large, because essentially people in the United States especially are opposed to these interventions. They oppose these wars. I mean, poll after poll shows they don't want these wars. They elected Obama because he said he would stop meddling around the world. They elected Trump. He said he would stop meddling around the world. Trump turned to Jeb Bush and said, everyone knows your brother lied us into a war. There were no weapons of mass destruction. The American people don't want wars. The American people understand that there's a group of billionaires and bankers that run the government, not the people. But yet, you know, to so many of them, that just leads them to become more right-wing and more libertarian and more believing in capitalism and not understanding anti-imperialism and you know, the need for socialism and such. And I think that we need to figure out how we can shift our tactics to get to the broad masses of people. That's my feeling. Just like the Latin American revolutionaries did, right? They understood, you know, in the 70s and 80s, they had to work in the countryside. They had to wage guerrilla warfare, facing military dictatorships, not being able to organize the cities. But they shifted their tactics when the conditions changed. We need to figure out in the West how we can shift our tactics because the conditions have changed with the economic crisis.
Thank you, Caleb. I understand that Orietta is ready to go. Perfect.
Mira, ahora le di al mute, no sé si me oyen.
Sí.
Ah,
We can
you
hear
hear
you.
me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I am very glad to be here with you. And well, I will like to talk about the situation in Venezuela, even if my good friend Daniel Gasparri has said a lot and say almost everything about Venezuela. And I would like to tell you how United States, the problem with United States that is that they consider Latin America like their backyard. And I'm sorry. Now I start my video. Okay. Okay, I will tell you that United States consider Latin America its backyard, and that's why that is the reason why they always try to overthrow Venezuela government, because Venezuela is a bad example. Venezuela is a government that doesn't want to be under under United States, and they want a government that say always okay with them, and they want to take all the richness that Venezuela has, not only the oil, but the oil, the gold, all the other minerals, you know, the other richness that Venezuela has. At the same time, Venezuela is a bad example, because Venezuela can demonstrate that you can have another style of government. You can have a government that that do things for the people. You have a government that doesn't put economy before every other things. And I think now Venezuela has is demonstrating that what you have for the people is very important. Now that we have the coronavirus, Venezuela has a very low death in the country, and at the same time they demonstrate that public medical system is the best way to try to how you say to overthrow a pandemic. And they demonstrate the difference with the United States, with Brazil, for example, that has a lot of people who die. And even if a lot of people is dying, the governments of United States and the governments of Brazil, they are only speaking about the economic problems. They want to open again all the society. They want to open jobs. They want to open all the things that they have closed because of the pandemic, and they don't worry about people. I think it's very important to know that United States, together with their ally, they have tried everything against Venezuela, everything to overthrow the government. The last thing is precisely this Gideon operation that is really a mercenary war. They try to make, together with Colombia, they try to make a mercenary army to overthrow the government. They try to do something like they did in Nicaragua when they against the Nicaraguan revolution. Even this attempt to overthrow the government, to kill President Maduro and to kill the most important people from the Venezuelan government has failed, and they demonstrate that the people of Venezuela are prepared to, and they are very aware of what can happen in Venezuela. For example, the people who came to the La Guaira to the beach, to the Chuao, Chuao town in the Venezuela coast. They were taken by, not only by Venezuela army, but Venezuela people. Venezuelan people are prepared to defend the country from every other country that try to overthrow Venezuela government. At the same time, now they try all fake news against Venezuela. For example, now they are saying that it's not true what the government said about the coronavirus victims. They say that there were 30,000 victims in Venezuela. Did you imagine something more, I say more stupid, because it's very difficult that you can not show 30,000 deaths. They try to say every kind of fake news against Venezuela, like they, for example, William Barr, the attorney, the U.S. attorney, tried to say that Venezuela government is a narco government, and is the most terrible thing is that they work, the United States work together with Colombia, when Colombia is the country that has that produced most cocaine in the world, but they say that Venezuela is a narco country, and that is an excuse to send to the Caribbean Sea all the ships and all the military equipment to, they say, to fight against the drugs, the traffic of the drugs, but really they are trying to blockade Venezuela. They couldn't blockade, for example, the ships that came from Iran, because Venezuela and Iran are very, very, very good friends and allies. We have a lot of allies in the world, and are allies that logically don't like the United States. Our friends are the Russian, the Chinese, Iran, and a lot of other countries in the world. When for example, people, I mean, the media, the big media that are the ones who are supporting the imperialism, really, is the best and the big army that imperialism has are the media. And the media saying that Guaido is supported by almost 50 countries, and they don't say that countries in the world are 193. That's why 50 countries is only a very small number of countries who are supporting Guaido as a president when he never anybody elected him. And but you know, I think nowadays countries, a lot of countries, and above all the European countries, they realize that they have made a big mistake supporting and recognizing Juan Guaido, but they don't know what to do now, and they don't want, they are afraid of the reaction of United States. And that's why they don't want to, I mean, they want to not to support Juan Guaido, but they don't know what to do. And United States has been, is a participation in all the intent of overthrowing the government of Venezuela. Have been demonstrated with a lot of proof. Venezuela don't not only say things, but take proof. We have taken proof to United Nations. We have taken proof to the Security Council. And the most terrible thing is that most of the government in the war, even with proof, even we have sent the proof to everybody, they don't say anything, and they still do what United States said what they have to do. And now, for example, the problem with the coronavirus, we think, at least I think, that is the coronavirus now is being used by some countries like biological weapon against Venezuela, because most of the cases that now, the 80% of the cases of coronavirus in this moment in Venezuela are Venezuelans who are coming back from other countries. For example, for Colombia and for Brazil, and where the number of people infected by coronavirus is very, very high. And have been, there is the proof that said by the Venezuelan who with they came back from Colombia. They said that they were okay when they were in Colombia, and the Colombian government suddenly offered them some buses to go to Venezuela, and these buses were the one who the Colombian government used to translate people sick with coronavirus. That's why it's a way to send this virus and to send like I said, like a biological weapon against Venezuela. The imperialism of the United States is trying to do everything because they are realizing that they cannot overthrow the Venezuelan government. And they try to use the country, the other country who are in favor of United States, like for example, Colombia. It's terrible to say this, but because it's our neighbor, because Colombian people are really our brothers. There are a lot of Venezuelans that have double nationality. They are Colombian and they are Venezuela, but Colombian government is our worst enemy nowadays. And the other thing I think is very important to realize is that the government who has, the country who are in the worst way because of the victim of coronavirus are precisely the governments who has been always in favor of neoliberalism, people who the government are rightist governments. For example, all the government of the Lima group who went against Venezuela, all the government of the Lima group are the ones who are the worst in this moment in with the victims of coronavirus. For example, Peru, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, etc. Ecuador, they are all in very bad shape because they destroy with their neoliberal measures, they destroy their public system of health. And that has been terrible for the people of these countries. And well, I will tell you that Venezuela has been persecuted from the United States against since the moment that President Chavez won the election. Since that moment, there has been there has been an attack from the United States all the time, but in the last year, 2019, has been the worst year against Venezuela from United States and from the other countries that they allied, especially Colombia. And And nowadays that we have this terrible pandemic, this COVID-19, United States, even if most of the countries of the world in the General Assembly of the United Nations, and they have said that they have to stop the sanction, they have to for the people, to protect the people, to make the possibility of solidarity between countries, because that is the only way to fight against coronavirus. But United States doesn't understand that, doesn't want to know about that, and United States instead increase the sanction, increase the measures against Venezuela. The last thing that, the one important thing nowadays is to say that Venezuela, United States all the time said that Venezuela, the government of Venezuela doesn't want to accept humanitarian aid. Venezuela really doesn't need humanitarian aid. The government accept this humanitarian aid if arrive from United Nations, from the international organizations that are legal to do that. But really what Venezuela needs is that all the money that has been looted by the sanction of United States, all the money who is in the banks of the world, that they have to be, it had to be liberated and had to be to return to Venezuela. There are more than 18 billion of dollars in several international banks. For example, Citibank, the Bank of England, Union Bank, Euroclear, Novo Bank of Portugal, and at the same time, England, it's terrible to say that, but the Bank of England has looted more than 1.7 billion of Venezuela gold. And now Venezuela is making have denounced that and is making a legal measures against that. And you know, to demonstrate that Venezuela wants the gold and wants its richness to help the people, the Venezuela government has said that they accept that the value of this gold go directly to the United Nations for the United Nations buying medicine and food for the Venezuelan people. And that is important that people in the world know that the sanction and the blockade of the United States is not, like they say, against some government, some person in the government, but it's against all the people of Venezuela. It's against the 30 million of Venezuelan people who is suffering. Some of them have died because of lack of medicine in some moments, because of this sanction, because of this blockade. Blockade is a crime against humanity. And Venezuela has going to the international court, and I hope, and all the Venezuelan people hope, that there'll be justice in the world. And you know, the most terrible thing that imperialists and United States demonstrate with their action is that they don't have any, they don't respect any international law, they don't respect any international organization. They decide that they have the power and they have military power and they can do everything they want in the world. Exactly. I think they have demonstrated that they want to fight against everybody who doesn't accept their ideas, that don't accept what they want. And that's why they consider that all the world they have to be their ally, but not only ally, they have to be their subject and accept everything the United States say. I want to finish, say that I hope that people in the world that are the ones who really can fight for their freedom and can fight for a better world, understand that neoliberalism, the capitalism in its worst way, is really the only thing that can do is kill people. That if we want a better world, if we want freedom, we have to fight to have better governments, and the governments who really have a preoccupation for people, who do laws for people, who have medical, social system to help people. I think the solidarity is very important, and not the militarism that Donald Trump said. Donald Trump has only this way of fighting in the war. He thinks that the militarism is the solution, that they can do everything because they have an army, and now in this moment they are trying to bring 800 soldiers in Colombia, in the borders with Venezuela. They are trying to attack Venezuela from everywhere, and it's terrible. A country in Latin America is like that, that prefer to submit to the United States than to help another friend, another country friend. That's why we hope for a better world, and we have all the countries, I think, have to fight against sanctions. There are 42 countries in the world who suffer the sanction of the United States, and I think this country would be very important that be together, fight together against United States, against the sanction of the United States. Sanction has not it's not possible to have sanction against country, because sanction against country and sanction against the people, and they kill people. That's why that is what I hope for: a better world, a world with solidarity, and a world without sanction. Thank you.
Gracias, Orieta and Daniel. And of course to Tim and Caleb as well. So at this point, we will break it into breakout rooms. I think that we will limit it to 10 minutes for a really quick discussion. People can raise the questions that they've raised in the chat room. In the chat, they can raise that in the chat room. And any other thing that you'd like to discuss. And then we'll come back and we'll quickly ask the speakers to respond to a couple of questions. Caleb's responded to the question about how do we fight imperialism. So I'd like to ask, give other people the opportunity as well. And I just ask the speakers to kind of wrap it up as quickly as you can. So Anissa, if you'd like to break us into rooms, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me, but have fun.
Okay.
We got the ejector seat.
Yeah, sorry, it's a little bit sudden in pushing you out.
I hope everybody enjoyed the breakout room, and it kind of gave a bit of a breathing space. We could launch now into the questions that some people have posed, and get the speakers to answer those questions. So one of the questions that we started off with, and Caleb answered this question, was how can we fight imperialism? So Tim, would you like to add anything to that discussion?
Thank you, Helen. We had the four of us had a little discussion about a focus on sanctions in terms of it's something that we can do, from where we are, because there is some theoretical accountability we have because our government is involved in it directly. And Len raised that. And then I made one point that, 2 points actually. One, that perhaps we should not be talking about sanctions, but using the phrase that the 18 ambassadors of countries who are under these measures use, which is unilateral coercive measures, because that makes it clear that the sanction is something in breach of international law, unilateral coercive measure. There are some other illegalities in there, like the fact that, deliberate harm to populations. Pompeo talks about the Iranian people, if they want to eat, they'll change their system, these sorts of things. And also the impact on third parties. But I think unilateral coercive measures flags what they call sanctions, which sounds a bit legitimate, like a punishment for breaching a rule type of thing. None of it's legal. So it's something we can use, or anyone can use in their own country if their state, their government's joined in those sorts of measures. The other point I wanted to make there was that we've got to focus on Venezuela, which is good because we've got a lot of people who support Venezuela and are interested in Venezuela. But I don't think we should miss the opportunity to link up with the international collaboration, particularly because 2 months ago, 18 of those ambassadors from Venezuela, but from Russia and China and Cuba and Syria and Iran and so on, put that letter to the UN Secretary General identifying unilateral coercive measures and saying, what are you going to do about it? Of course, they're talking about the UN confronting the US, which hasn't happened, for all the structural reasons we know. But nevertheless, I think probably we should, ride in on that precedent that people may be more favorably disposed to Venezuela than to, say, North Korea. But the principle is much the same, I think. So I think let's have a look at that letter from the 18 ambassadors, and why not, if we're going to campaign against unilateral coercive measures, the economic war, then let's start off by linking up those, all of those countries that are under that threat.
Yes.
Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more. I think it would be a brilliant campaign to run. Daniel, would you like to comment on the question? How can we fight imperialism?
Yes, apologies, but I didn't hear very well the question. It was cutting off. I don't know if you can resume it for me, or.
Sure. The question is essentially how can we fight imperialism? Yeah,
certainly there are. The best way to fight imperialism is try to put as much as solidarity together. There are almost 40 countries in the world who are facing unilateral coercive measures, as Tim said before. And so there's a big number of countries who are against US sanctions. But not only those ones. If you go back to UN and you see in the last 3-4 years when they are trying to put a position regarding the world against Cuba sanctions, you will see that most of the countries in the world, even though Australia, supports this decision to withdraw the sanctions against Cuba, which are making a big damage to the people of Cuba. There's in the past, dear cameras, if you see the history, these measures, they won't overthrow any government in the world. There are no political changes because of coercive measures against the country. It's something which Tim said before when he was on his speech, and it's very true. US don't go against strong countries. They never go against big countries. They don't go against countries who are real threats for them. They only go against Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, which they know that they cannot fight, against, the imperialism. I'm very honest in this because we need to be clear the position where we are. The best way to fight imperialism is try to build a solidarity platform all around the world, letting people know what's happening. Solidarity, letting people, be part of the solidarity with these countries. Not only Venezuela. I'm not talking about, I talk about Venezuela today, but when I talk about Venezuela, I'm talking about a lot of other countries in the world. What's happening in Venezuela now is not only in Venezuela. It's happening in Syria, it's happening in Cuba, it's happening in Iran, it's happening everywhere. Everywhere. We can talk for hours about what the sanctions mean. So which are the rights from US in order to, apply sanctions against countries in the world? Why they take this decision? Are they, the big, policemen of the world? Why they have the right to do this? None in the world like this. Not even Australia. I say you, even on this position that is very clear for all of us. Most of you are in Australia, and I'm not entitled to talk about Australian politics, and you know that. But certainly now you can see Australia very, very close to Trump's administration. There's clear for all of us. But not even in this moment, I'm sure that Australia will vote in favor of the blockade against Cuba. So there is no reason for the US, there is no rights for US to apply coercive measures against any country in the world. And solidarity, certainly, Helen, is the biggest challenge for the whole world, and it's the future of the world. There's no other future. As you know, as Caleb before he mentioned, the imperialism is coming down, it's falling down. There are no way for them to maintain, all these big, monster, which they think that people is trying to buy. It's not true. Look what's happening now in Minneapolis. And that spreads all around US, around the world, not only in Minneapolis, around the world. And what we need to do, it was only one man, but that means a big movement around the world who's just fighting against what happened, against racism. And which is the major responsible of what's happened yesterday, on it's happening now in US, is Mr. Trump, because he promotes racism, he promotes xenophobia. Only 3 days before this policeman killed this black man, he was promoting the force against people. Only 3 days before, he said that they will need to be very strong against people who were trying to go against the law. So there's solidarity. Just to finish, is the biggest, the more important thing that we can do against this imperialism, which certainly is not going to last for a long more. I'm very sure, and I agree with Caleb Maupin. There's no way for them. It's close to die, And imperialism usually is very tied to the big financial, economic supports. And now the history of the world is moving more to China, more to other countries. So that means that they cannot sustain anymore these, imperialist actions against the world.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. Orieta, would you like to contribute to that discussion?
Ahorita, okay.
Yes. I would like to say that against the unilateral coercive measures, and Tim is right, we have to say that we cannot say sanctions, because sanctions are against somebody who do something bad. And this country hasn't done anything bad, but have done very good things for their people. And I think against unilateral coercive measures, the important thing is between the country, unity and solidarity. And unity and solidarity, because these 42 countries who suffer this, they have to be together against imperialism, against the United States, that doesn't have any right to be the police of the world. And at the same time, I think we have to, together, the country have to change, to try to change international organization. We have to change United Nations. We have to have a democratization of them. Cannot be possible that all the countries, like the last time in the Security Council about Venezuela, all the countries were against and were they were denouncing this this mercenary action in Venezuela. They made a statement, and the veto of United States prohibit to have this document, to approve this document made, but for the majority of the country. That's why the only way to fight against United States is the unity of country of the world who want to do good things for their people.
Thank you, Orieta. I couldn't agree more as well. I think we also need to remember that should Australia desire its independence, freedom from imperialism, we would also face sanctions or unilateral coercive measures against us. So nobody's immune to the effects of the United States and US imperialism. So another question that's been posed is, what kind of internal struggle does these sanctions pose for the multinational countries? Imperialism is based on free trade, the need to control the world's resources. So how do these unilateral coercive measures, is everybody united about these measures, or are the ruling classes fighting? So Caleb, if we could get you to answer that question.
Well, it's very clear that the primary difference between the Trump administration and the Obama administration was which countries to go after. I mean, that was the primary difference. Obama wanted to escalate with North Korea and was open to negotiating with Cuba, whereas Trump wants to, has rolled back a lot of what Obama did to loosen the sanctions on Cuba, has escalated against Venezuela, but he tried to negotiate with North Korea. And that seems to be the difference. There are different interest groups, right? That Trump is very close to the Miami Cubans. That's a very wealthy community of people who fled from Cuba. And he has gone there and given speeches to them, and he panders to them. And often they want to give specific priority to Latin America over the Middle East and over different parts of the world. Trump is also, interestingly, very close to the in Los Angeles, the Iranian exile community, and the Pahlavi family, the monarchy or whatever. He's very close to them, and he seems to have this relationship with these special constituencies that have a particular interest group. Whereas the Obama administration was closer with the Council on Foreign Relations and the bigger think tanks that tend to be thinking more long-term about the long-term interests of empire and utilizing soft power and destabilization and all of that. And that seems to be the divide. Now, Trump also has a special relationship with Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos is Trump's Secretary of Education, and her brother is Eric Prince, who is the owner of the Blackwater Academy Military Corporation, right? And so he has a particular relationship with her and with military contractors around the world and with weapons manufacturers. I mean, Trump went to the Middle East. He was trying to build an Arab NATO. He wants to build weapons. Whereas it seems like the Obama administration was closer with the big oil companies and closer with the intelligence agencies and the soft power apparatus. And there's long been a divide in the United States between the intelligence agencies and the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex wants to blow things up and have big wars. The intelligence agencies want to work very, very slowly and covertly to manipulate internal contradictions of countries and destabilize things. And that division seems to be playing out. And it's not a question of one, are the Democrats less likely to go to war or are they more favorable? It's a question of who they want to go after and how they want to do it. And increasingly, as we see this big economic crisis in the Western capitalist countries, the rate of profit is dropping. And so the capitalists are more competitive with each other for those profits. So while, in the 1980s, it seemed like Ronald Reagan, he used to always say, we're all friends after 6, meaning that the Democrats and the Republicans would disagree. But at the end of the day, they all basically voted for the same laws. They had the same foreign policy. Carter called himself a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Ronald Reagan gave Zbigniew Brzezinski the Medal of Freedom. They basically carried out the same foreign policy, maybe a different tone of voice, but it was the same. Now it seems like there are competing interests among America's ruling class about what countries to attack, what countries to negotiate with, and that's the division here. And Trump has particular friends. The Obama administration, the Democrats have particular friends, and they're trying to figure out how to fight with each other and how to push back against each other. And of course, when these contradictions exist, that creates an opening for the people. That creates an opening for the people to assert themselves, and those who don't want any wars and those who don't want capitalism to continue to assert their wishes as the capitalists scramble with each other over profits and such.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Caleb. Sorry. Tim, would you like to make a comment?
No, Helen, I think other people have got a chance to say some things.
Would anybody else like to comment? Daniel, would you like to make a comment on beautiful, okay, whether or not there's a divide, or do the imperialists see, are they on the same page in terms of the sanctions, in terms of unilateral coercive measures against countries, or is it creating their downfall if they can't exploit the world because there's sanctions against them?
Actually, I will say something if you like, after Daniel's had something to say. Daniel?
Oh, please move forward.
Okay, so on that point, and Caleb makes a very good point, a very interesting, reflective point, because the difference between the two parties in the US is an important thing for people to understand. But I would just point out, as someone who studied the blockade on Cuba, that under George W. Bush, who imposed some extra restrictions on Cuba, he stopped educational visits and so on, slowed tourism right down and so on. But it wasn't until the Obama administration came along that the Office of Financial Asset Control moved away from spending all their time on fining US citizens $1,000 for bringing in a box of Cuban cigars. They had their agents in Mexico. I remember once I was coming back to Cuba to Mexico from Cuba, and some guy came up to me and said, have you got any cigars? I said, who are you? And he realized I wasn't a US citizen, and he backed away. But that was what they were spending their time doing up until 2008. Along comes Obama, and if you count it up, and they're all on the OFAC site, you've got something like $5 or $6 billion in fines, mainly on European banks, enacted under the Obama administration. This is the guy who re-established diplomatic relations in 2014. I'll say something about Australia there in a moment, but the Obama administration was systematically fining all of those European banks because they trawled through the records and found that it was mainly to do with Iran and Cuba. And then they imposed fines that were getting into the hundreds of millions of dollars each bank. And it was the price, and I made a table of that, and that's in the chapter on sanctions in my latest book too. But it was the price of doing business in the US. They said theoretically that if a Japanese or a European company had 10% US shares, that meant the US could apply its rules. But in practice, they could do it even without that, because it meant to say, okay, you want to do business with Iran or Cuba, fine, just forget about your business in the US. And so this was a long, sustained campaign. Of course, we know, as Daniel pointed out, that Cuba had a long, sustained campaign of diplomacy, which brought almost every country on earth in favor of their motion against the blockade against Cuba in that year, when both the Washington and Israel abstained on the Cuban motion, and there was no country against the Cuban motion condemning the blockade, but the blockade wasn't lifted effectively because it was more in US law than to do with the US president. Only a small part of it had to do with the US president. So what I'm saying is, yes, I agree with Caleb, there's a great continuity, but with a different flavor, a different emphasis that comes along. Trump seemed like he was a pragmatist and wanted to get out of the losing war in Syria, but he wanted to go for Iran, so there are these differences in flavor, and maybe it was to do with those particular connections. I might just say in relation to Australia, because most of us here are from Australia, that the Australian administration, and it was the Labor one at the time, re-established, or let's say established very friendly relationships with Cuba 4 years before the Obama administration. Why? Because Cuba had moved its medical training program into the Pacific Islands, and within about 3 years had significant influence in a large number of the Pacific Islands, was training more doctors than Australia was. And Australia, which had been effectively delegated a role by Washington to protect this part of the planet largely from Chinese influence, that's the big strategy, didn't see Cuba as a threat. And so they decided to join the Cubans instead of opposing them. And so Daniel will recognize this, that from 2010 onwards, there was a honeymoon, and still a honeymoon, even though they haven't done a huge amount, but nevertheless, very good diplomatic relationships with Cuba on pragmatic grounds, more or less. So these things are subject to vagaries. Yes, and I think someone made the point, might have been Orietta, that even the conservative administrations in Canberra oppose the US blockade of Cuba because of that diplomatic history, more or less. But when it comes to critical issues, Canberra is always at the beck and call of Washington, basically. That is to say, there's room for us to move there. There's room for us to get them to back down on the blockade of Venezuela, to back down on the blockade of Syria, to back down on the blockade of Iran. And I think together they work more strongly when they're put together.
Thank you, Tim. Orietta, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I agree with Tim with all the things he has said. And when I was saying about the changing of international organization, is precisely thinking about, for example, we know that the General Assembly of the United Nations every year, with the exception of United States, Israel, and last time of Brazil, but they always vote against the blockade of Cuba. But the blockade is still there. It's 60 years and nothing happened. That's why I think there has to be a change to make the decision, for example, of the United Nations, the decision of the majority of the people of the world, the government of the countries of the world. There have to be a way, there have to be a change in this international organization to make this decision to be compelling, to be useful, because only to be real. That's why I think we have to fight for that.
Yeah. Just a reminder that the questions that that I'm asking are from the chat area, and it's really for the speakers that we're kind of having answering questions. So, but if anybody would like to make a comment, please do it through the chat, and I'll. It just saves a lot of toing and froing and keeps the process going. So, one of the other questions that somebody asked was, and this is for anybody any of the speakers that know, when is it likely that the gold that the court case would be resolved in terms of the gold? And leading on to that also is, can you talk a little bit more about the attempted coup on the 3rd of May? So Daniel, that might be one for you.
Yeah, yes, I'm close to run the battery, so I'm running for having a cable. But certainly, our Minister of Foreign Affairs took the decision with the government, of course, to bring this case into the International Penal Court. And this, all the evidence that we are putting together will be brought to the court. I'm very sure that it will come some justice, in this case, and certainly the gold will come back to us. Many people ask us why that gold was in London, and certainly there are many reasons. The first thing is because these big banks in the world have been traditionally been used to hold the gold in order to give the certification that the gold was there and that allow you to do business and to be a serious business partner in the world. So actually, because of this stage, we are not willing to be, to have this certification. We ask them to give us back the gold. And we all, by the way, it's good to know that we repatriate a lot of this gold already. It was a lot more. We bring it back home, but still we left some there, and it's of course very unfair. But Great Britain is following also the the decisions of US regarding these measures, and they said that we are not allowed to take the gold. So as Orieta said before, certainly it's a lot of money, which of course we need, especially in this moment. And it's very unfair because finally this money and this gold comes into anybody. You don't know, it's like the money we have in the banks because the US control the system, the bank system. So they steal the money and you don't know where this money is going, but you don't see it anymore. That happens to Cuba many years ago. Of course, they have 60 years of experience. Now they are very smart. They know how to do things, but we are still learning. Since they have 20 years, we have 20 years, they have 60 years. So I think there's a lot of things that we need still to learn from Cuba and try to be more, like cautious about what's happening in the world, but certainly sooner or later that will come to us.
Thank you, Daniel.
¿Alguna parte?
Orieta, would you like to add anything to that?
¿Puedo o no? Sí, me toca quedar parado. Sorry.
Orieta, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think we have done something very good, our government, making, going to the international court. I hope the international court will go to really to administrate justice. That is what we need, because we need something to be against this way that the United States is doing things, that the United States thinks that is the government of all the world. That's why I think the international court is very important, and precisely at Venezuela to overthrow all the arguments that say that maybe the gold in Venezuela is going to be, I don't know, to make Maduro and all his other people in government very rich, and that they take the gold. Venezuela has said, we want the gold, we want money to buy medicine and food for the people. That's why we want that the gold we send it directly to the United Nations. They have an agreement with the United Nations. In that way, United Nations provide what Venezuela needs.
Gracias. Does anybody, I think at this stage, we've been going for about 2.5 hours now, 2 hours and 15 minutes. I think that at the stage we'll invite Joe to maybe wrap the afternoon up, and I think that certainly out of this we can take something away from this and start to build a united movement. So Joe, would you like to wrap everything up?
Okay. First thing, I think this has been a great discussion of considerable depth, and I think we've got something really to go away with. Really, I think as people have been saying, to sum up, that the world is moving into a period of deep crisis in the certainly of capitalism, of imperialism, and to a level that has not been seen for over half a century. And so we need to realise that, and we need to prepare for that. Part of this is that that there's been a shift away from manipulation, the politics of manipulation, to the politics of force, and that is getting stronger. We need to watch that out. And that brings in the whole sanctions thing, because sanctions is really what used to be called trade war on this scale. And the historical experience is that a high level of trade war tends to lead to shooting war. And that is a threat that we do have a little bit down the track. So we need to keep that in mind. Okay, some of the big issues that were raised today are, again, imperialism is about making the people poor. So we need to get that out there. I think there's a fair understanding that in the world today, those who are in charge make a lot of other people poorer, but we need to develop that. I think we have some challenges, and they've been mentioned here today in general. Two things in particular. One is that a campaign in isolation of a select group's not going to make a great deal of difference. We need to find a way of getting down to the base, connecting with the masses of people, and actually creating a genuine movement which is broad, which is big. So we need to face that challenge. Associated with that, and both Caleb and Tim raised it, is the problem inherited within, broad commas, the left. The sectarianism, the inability to see how the change, contemporary change, is coming, the inability to work together. For instance, for this event, there's some evidence now that there have been certain groups that have actually worked against it. There's actually another webinar, counter-webinar, being organised for today. This sort of inability to work together, because our mob has got to be in charge. We've got to get away from that mentality and say, right, we're all in charge. It's got to come up from the base. So they're the two big challenges I think that we're facing in general as a movement. Okay, converting this into practice, because that was the next thing, because we need to have some practical things. And Caleb raised building the resistance, building this movement. Okay, what forms of organisation do we need? What forms that actually involves the many, but not only the few? How do we broaden the base? And how do we have a build up from the ground up rather than try to do something from the top down? So that's a big question we need to face. I think Tim's idea of unilateral coercive measures, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we need to get used to that, because I think, as people have said, sanctions are a big part of the picture, what's going on. We need to take that on in the case of Venezuela, and we need to build that movement in a global sense as well. I think this leads us to another question that was raised, that certainly in the breakout room, some of us were in, and that is relates to the differences within different countries, and what sort of strategy do we use to challenge imperialism? Well, we have to take account the conditions vary from country to country. So in their specifics, they will find different ways of finding answers according to their own situation. And we need to respect that. We need to respect variety. But at the same time, there is a commonality, because we are facing the same challenge, the same enemy. And the question of supporting how others choose in other nations, other movements choose to fight. The important thing is that they're fighting, and we just support that they're fighting. Okay, that's the question of solidarity. It's crucial. It's not only small countries like relatively small countries like Venezuela and Cuba and so on, but I'd imagine people fighting imperialism in the United States would value some solidarity from other places as well. It applies to all of us. We all need that support. So that's basically what I picked up from the discussion today. I'll throw in a couple little bit, but also I want to announce two things. I want to say that there is a letter around which you can get around for people to get signed supporting Venezuela. It's a specific letter to do with Venezuela, and we can get this around. And the second one, given in light of what's been discussed and building this resistance around the sanctions, sorry, the other term, perhaps we should be arranging as soon as possible another chat if people are agreed, and we'll take that matter forward another step.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. And I think, and once again, thank you to all of our speakers. It was absolutely great to have you here. I think clearly the world is changing, and we're part of it, and we just need to keep developing our movement. And I say that for all of us, our movement. It's our movement. So thank you to all of the speakers once again. Thank you to everybody that came along. We will be in touch. We will try to keep you. We will keep you informed of what we're doing, and we'll get involved with other things that other people are doing as well. So we're going to sign off and
you,
talk
Helen.
to you guys sometime in the near future for sure.
That was it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. All the best.
All the best.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm out of here.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's go there. Yeah.
Everybody need to leave.
Okay.